The governor wants to build a new prison in Hālawa to replace the aging and overcrowded Oahu prison in Kalihi, but needs $500 million to do it. Lawmakers are again considering the idea of buying the federal detention center near the airport. A task force says the state should rethink its prison strategy to one of rehabilitation over incarceration. What do you think? Tonight's live broadcast and live stream of Insights on PBS Hawai'i start now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Laura Yamada. Hawaii's prisons are overcrowded and expensive to maintain. In 1984, the American Civil Liberties Union sued the state, citing inhumane and unconstitutional conditions. The state settled that lawsuit and promised to do better. 2 years ago, the ACLU stepped in again, citing similar problems. In December, a task force commissioned by the legislature to study Hawaii's prisons issued its report. It called for, quote, immediate and profound change. The report's primary recommendation is that, quote, Hawaii immediately begin to transition from a punitive to a rehabilitative correctional system. So our guests tonight include the chair of the task force, a public policy advocate for Native Hawaiians, a prosecutor, and the director of the Hawaii's prison system. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email, call, or tweet your questions, and you're going to find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and on the PBS Hawaii Facebook page. Now to our guests. Michael Wilson is an Associate Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court who chaired the task force that studied Hawaii's prison policies. Kamaile Maldonado is an attorney with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. She has worked to improve the lives of Native Hawaiians, including in the area of criminal justice. Justin Kohler is the prosecuting attorney for the County of Kauai, an elected position he has held since 2012. And Nolan Espinda is the director of the Hawaii Department of Public Safety, an appointed position he's held since 2014. He was previously the warden at the Hālawa Correctional Facility. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. There's a lot going on and a lot of developments fairly recently. So let's talk about that first. Let's talk about the task force and get people a little bit familiar who aren't familiar with the task force, what the process is for the task force, and who's been involved in this.
All right, well, thank you very much for covering this issue, because it's going to be one of the most important issues that Hawaii has faced, in large part because, for one thing, the amount of money involved. We're talking about potentially over $500 million, which would be the state's largest construction project as opposed to rail at the county level. So that is a way of understanding what this task force is about. The legislature created a task force through a joint resolution that was designated to provide recommendations about, in some ways, the best way to look at it is how to spend $500 million in a way that would, it was formed in 2015, July of 2015. But the actual mandate is to address the way the correctional system should proceed in order to protect public safety, and also to make this a more economic approach to administering the prisons. So our recommendations hopefully will save well over $100 million in a way that isn't necessarily new. It's consistent with best practices that move a correctional system from a punitive model to a rehabilitative model.
So I want to get everybody involved in just a minute here, but before we do, since the report just came out fairly recently, get everybody up to speed as to what the main findings and recommendations of the report are.
The main findings are that it's necessary to invest in treatment and be able to use systems that have been in place for some time now throughout the United States and other parts of the world that involve effective rehabilitation. And technically what that means is to take the individuals that shouldn't be incarcerated and move them into a setting that's less expensive where they can get treatment, and therefore the recidivism rate, or the rate at which people repeat offenses, will be reduced. We have a very high recidivism rate in the state of Hawaii, and we also incarcerate a lot of people that have not even been convicted of a crime. There are 1,100 people, approximately, at the jail. This isn't the prison, which is Hālawa, this is the jail. And of those 1,100, approximately 47% or almost half have not been convicted of a crime. So you can see the opportunity to take people, particularly if they have substance abuse problems that are sitting in jail, haven't been tried yet, haven't been convicted, and move them into a setting where they can get treatment. And there are many of them that would commit to getting treatment so that they didn't have to be held in prison.
So the recommendations, you touched on some of the parties that would likely be involved in being part of this task force. Maybe touch on that just a little bit more. Who else was involved in this, and are we talking about a unanimous consensus here, or was there a little bit debate within the task force?
That's one of the exciting things about what's taking place. You know, we have a partnership with public safety. We have a partnership with law enforcement agencies. The prosecutor for the city and county of Honolulu has been part of our task force, as well as the Department of Public Safety. Office of Hawaiian Affairs has provided a tremendous amount of leadership, because we definitely have to change the cycle of incarceration that applies to the Hawaiian community. And there are other members of our task force that come from the judiciary and as well as from the Hawaiian community.
So plenty to break down here, but sort of setting the scene as far as what's happened recently with the task force. Let's talk to you, Kamaile. You've been so involved with OHA and what they're doing with Native Hawaiians, and there's been, we were talking about some other task force that have involved specifically in that as well in recent years. What are your thoughts as far as what's come out of this task force and how that needs to be folded into what your focus is and what OHA's focus is?
Yeah, so as you just mentioned, back in 2010, OHA published a report called The Disparate Treatment of Native Hawaiians in the Criminal Justice System, which basically revealed that Native Hawaiians are not only overrepresented in the criminal justice system, which they always have been in Hawaii, and at that time were at about 40% of the incarcerated population, but also were, for all other things remaining equal, were disproportionately represented in an accumulating rate at various points with their contact in the criminal justice system. So while they were not necessarily using drugs at a higher rate or not necessarily more criminal than other ethnic groups, that they were being arrested more, charged more, receiving convictions more, longer sentences, et cetera. And so in 2012, the Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force was put forth by the legislature, which essentially put forth a lot of recommendations, some specific and some more broad, about ways to kind of address that issue, reduce the overpopulation of the overrepresentation of Native Hawaiians in the criminal justice system, and as well just generally make the system more, like Justice Wilson said, therapeutic, rehabilitative, to try to reduce our recidivism rates, make our successful reentry system a lot better, and to just generally improve the system. But what we saw after that was very little response to that. So what happened with the HCR 85 task force, focusing specifically on prison reform, but also kind of zooming out and recognizing that prison issues are community issues, and that a lot of the issues of criminality are really not best treated in the criminal justice system, but actually that is, where we are essentially treating a lot of our public health issues, our drug dependency issues, our mental health issues, and our issues with poverty and income inequality and homelessness.
Together.
And it all bottlenecks into the criminal justice system, because that's the way that essentially we've chosen to treat these issues, these socioeconomic and public health issues, in the most expensive way possible, by sending all of these people through the judiciary, through police, and through the public safety system. And so it's unfortunate, because what we see is that sending people to prison who have mental health issues and drug dependency actually doesn't make them better, it makes them worse. And sending people with very low level criminality actually increases their criminality and their likelihood of recidivism later in life, if they even spend just a short amount of time in jail or prison. So it's not only the most expensive way, it's the worst way to treat the issues. And so, like Justice Wilson says, a lot of the recommendations that the 2012 Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force made are folded into the recommendations of the HCR 85 Task Force, and specifically with relation to the Native Hawaiian community, looking at trying to expand the treatment court system and the diversion programs, trying to get that population of people who are surging into the system reduced, and trying to divert them into better community-based treatment facilities and improve culturally based programs, and then as well improve the reentry system to make sure that reentry and reintegration into the community can be more stable, so that people people can succeed outside instead of cycling back in.
Now, the research in the study that came out in 2012, that was a little more specific, a little more focused, obviously, on the Native Hawaiian population. How did that fold into the work that the task force has done, or did that stay somewhat separate? Was that
I would say it wasn't separate at all. From the very beginning, so one thing that we like to say at OHA is what's good for Hawaiians is good for Hawaii. And the same thing is true, especially with regard to the criminal justice system. So, although Native Hawaiians are disproportionately impacted by the punitive response to, drug policy and mental health issues and income inequality, that doesn't necessarily mean that the treatment is any different. We should be looking at all of these issues the same way for everybody, and the rising tide will lift all of the ships, we hope.
Here's a question from Sandra in Hilo. So currently, what rehabilitation programs exist in Hawaii's prison? For example, mainland prisons have programs where inmates are training service dogs for disabled people. What are the options?
Well, basically, our programs involve, are in two different categories, and a lesser third. The first category, of course, is treatment. Those can be in regards to sex offender treatment, substance abuse treatment, things of that nature. Secondarily, we have more basic educational and job training opportunities. And the third is purely vocational, as run through our Hawaii correctional industry system. So each inmate who comes into the system is put through a battery of tests, and they are each prescribed a prescriptive plan which indicates the program's treatment levels and different types of interactions they must complete prior to being paroled. And essentially, someone is eligible for parole after the minimum term set by Hawaii Paroling Authority and their successful completion of whatever was indicated in their prescriptive plan.
I want to expand on that a little more just a bit, but I want to talk to Justin here about your thoughts on the recommendations by the task force. And as prosecutor, what are the realities of how this would impact the way that you do your job, how the process might play out if these changes are implemented? Talk a little bit about that, because I think most people would agree that focusing on rehabilitation in some shape or form is a good thing.
Absolutely.
But when you start to break down the time, the cost, whatever types of avenues it may take, maybe that might change things. So what's the reality?
Yeah, and when you read the report, the recommendations are quite striking, because what they indicate is that we really need a systems-wide response to what we see as the criminal justice problem in Hawaii. And everything Kamaili said is right, everything Justice Wilson said is right, everything Nolan said is right, in that we need to be more rehabilitative, and Nolan does what he can to make his system as rehabilitative as possible. But what we have is, over the past several decades, we've seen the dismantling of our public health infrastructure in this country. And so now what happens is the criminal justice system we become the social workers of last resort. And so yes, we're spending $50,000 a year to put up somebody whose primary problem is a mental health issue that is resulting in their criminality. So what that means is, we need to devote those resources, not just in terms of building physical structures, but in terms of just getting professionals, mental health professionals, substance abuse professionals, to come work in Hawaii and to come work with this population. That is something that the agencies tasked with those duties, they have a tough time getting those clinicians, to come work on neighbor islands, to come work with prisoners, to come work with folks who have real serious problems with drug addiction or mental health problems that are going to take a long time to resolve. So, one challenge for us as prosecutors is, how do we identify early on in the case, that this is a person whose criminality is a result of something that we can actually address and rehabilitate and work with and get this person functioning back into the community. And that's why I've always been such a strong supporter of the alternative courts and the diversion programs, the jail diversion program, which we pioneered on Kauai, the mental health court. I mean, when I started as a prosecutor 11 years ago, we would spend a half a calendar once a month addressing just the mental health cases, the cases that were pending evaluation, that they were working with our mental health caseworkers. and getting those folks back into the community. Now we have to spend probably a solid calendar every week just dealing with that clientele, because it's expanded so dramatically and so rapidly over the years that we spend an inordinate amount of time in our criminal courts processing mental health cases rather than pure criminal cases. So, until we can push those processes back upstream and help these people get the assistance they need before they start committing crimes, before they really bottom out to the point where they land in a jail cell, we're going to see the same things repeating themselves.
I know all of you have expertise on this, but I want to bounce back to Director Espina. So how do you sort of quantify where you are right now with the programs that are available? And when you have such an influx, such a demand, such a large population, how tough is that? How much of a challenge is that to manage that? And what is changing that's within the population itself that is the most challenging for you and your staff?
The most challenging issue we face is that unlike the courts and unlike the Hawaii Paroling Authority, the Department of Public Safety does not have any authority to either deny the intake of any prisoner sent to us by the courts, nor to release any prisoner who has not been authorized to be released by Hawaii Paroling Authority. So essentially, our mechanism for controlling our population or minimizing our population is to do the best we can to assure that the recidivism rate can be as lowered as as extensively as possible. In 2005, the current baseline recidivism rate in Hawaii was set at 67%. That recidivism rate is controlled and authored by the Interagency Council on Intermediate Sanctions. We can look up their website at the AG's website. They set that rate in 2005. It is currently, as of 2017, at 47%. And if indeed you were to take away the part of the recidivism definition, which of course is any rearrest or any parole or probation violation revocation within 3 years. If you were to take away arrests for non-felony failure to appear for courts, the recidivism rate would be 37%. So what I try to always point out, and what the governor's done a tremendous job of pointing out, is that we are essentially forced to take every detainee that the court sent to us, and we are forced to retain every prisoner in our prisons until such time that HPA or the courts release them. So our opportunity to impact that population is to do our best to assure that those who are released do not return.
Here's a question. Are we offering prisoners the best vocational training for jobs available in Hawaii? We touched on some of the programs. I think people are interested in when you talk about some of the programs that are available within the prison system. What are some examples?
We have great programming out at the Women's. We have a huge farm at Waiawa. We have a farming operation at the Kulani Correctional Facility. Hawaii Correctional Industries runs sewing operations, print shop operations, furniture operations at the Hālawa Correctional Facility. There are multiple rehabilitative and vocational programs for inmates at just about at every one of our institutions.
Do you feel there needs to be more?
We can always use more, absolutely.
Is that a funding issue? Is it or just the volume that you're dealing with?
To the extent that more funding would provide for more programming, absolutely. But it's a three-legged milk stool. Milking stool. You need a job, a family unit, and a safe place to stay. If you have those three things, your opportunity to not recidivate and come back to jail or prison is greatly enhanced.
What are your thoughts across the table here when we're talking about, Director Espina saying, in some ways, my hands are a little tied here, if it is beholden upon us to manage this population that's coming in to the prison system. How do you see that? How do you respond to that?
It's a really critical way to understand the problem. For example, in 1978, there were approximately 700 incarcerated people. Now we have over 5,000. So what Director Espina is talking about is an increase in prison population that's over 650%. It's extraordinary. And we do not have room any longer for the incarcerated citizens of Hawaii. We send a little bit less than 2,000 people to the mainland to be incarcerated. So yes, the Department of Public Safety is in a very difficult situation. You talked about the lawsuit in 1980 where the ACLU went to federal court to have the federal court intervene so that the Hawaii prison system would improve. That was when we had 720 people. Now, again, we have over 5,000. So it can't be overemphasized that this is an extraordinary opportunity because the state has to spend an enormous amount of money to replace the jail. It's too old and it's too crowded. And public safety has been very overt and open about the fact that there have to be changes. And you asked before about how the task force is composed and how things have been coordinated. And it's exciting because right now there is, I guess you could say, unity of purpose with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs providing a lot of leadership using values of rehabilitation or aloha, and a sensible point of view being inputted by people like Justin and the prosecutor from the city and county of Honolulu. And now the legislature has been very open and has had extensive hearings. So I think we're working on improvement, but getting back to Director Spinda's point, there has to be change now because there are so many people that are incarcerated, and many of them, again, haven't even been convicted in the jail. They have not been convicted of a crime. So the diversionary programs that Kamaile was talking to are really important. But the idea of having reentry for inmates that are being released is critical to this. There need to be more resources so that when inmates aren't released, they aren't just dropped off outside of the prison and go to the bus stop, or they aren't backed up waiting for opportunities for furlough.
That was one of the questions. And it says for Director Spinda, but I think really it's a discussion for everyone, is lots of talk about reentry. What have you others done to implement a reentry program into the system?
Well, reentry was first verbalized in the legislature back in 2005. Then with the implementation of the justice reinvestment system, there actually were authorized by the legislature a series of positions for the Department of Public Safety. With the dispersal of much of the JRI monies, additional positions were provided to HPA, were provided to the prosecutor's crime victim compensation office, and as well as other offices throughout the state. So monies that would have gone to incarcerated people went to other agencies to assist them in releasing more bodies throughout the system. So nothing was done in regards to the Department of Public Safety's positions that were authorized all the way through 2014. So there was a 4-year period where progress could have been made, but nothing was done. Since 2014, we now have a full office purely designated for the reentry purposes, inclusive of a supervisor, 2 crime victim compensation specialists, 1 SAVIN specialist who takes care of statewide notifications for victims throughout the state whenever an incarcerated individual is going to be released or transferred, and then 3 program specialists. So just right off the bat, in the past 4 years, we have put into place the reentry office that was authorized and intended by the Justice Reinvestment System dating back to 2012.
So some of these changes have been made. Some positions have been filled. The program has developed somewhat. But I think we were talking about in the break room before some of the issues, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that some of the programs, supportive programs that need to happen for this process to work its way through were not necessarily either implemented or developed to the level to be able to handle this type of a transition in how we handle the justice programs. So what are your perspectives on that, and where are we at now, knowing that this is something that was pushed through the governor and through the legislature several years ago?
Well, I think this report really highlights, it paints the problem in very stark terms and lays out recommendations and highlights potential resolutions. So it's out in the open, everyone has it, and the question is, are we going to act? And yeah, that's going to require a tremendous amount of political will, because we're talking about more than, if we're going to change the way we look at criminal justice from A to Z, that's going to require not Band-Aids, that's going to require some serious surgery in terms of resources, in terms of our thought process around criminal justice. And yeah, the programs, it's all about the programs, it's all about the reentry, it's all about the support, because if we're going to reduce the number of people we have incarcerated, and we're going to put those people back in the community, we've got to be darn sure that they're ready to be back in the community. Because if we're going to put them back out in the community on a shorter sentence, and they don't have the support system they need, and we're going to be arresting them again in 6 weeks or 6 months, that doesn't help anybody. That jeopardizes public safety, and I think paints us all in a bad light. So.
And I'll let the rest of you jump in just a minute here, but this just leads to one of the questions that we have. Caller, taken criminology classes decades ago, recalls the same recommendations by the task force at the time, from what he recalls, and those recommendations remain then. From what nothing has really changed. Where can leaders find new ideas, or maybe motivation? When you have at the very least, the perception that, hey, we've done this before, we've tried this before, these recommendations have been made, and where are we now? And what is our belief that this time around it's going to be different?
I can take that. It has been done multiple times before. Even before the Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force, there were other task forces that made somewhat similar recommendations. And I would say that the difference is that there is a national movement going on right now. We are not the only ones tackling this issue. If you open the news on any given day, you can find other jurisdictions in other states, as well as the federal government, just thinking differently about all of the consequences that have occurred as a result of the 1970s and 80s, the war on drugs, and all of the extremely punitive policies that were put into place at that time, and the consequences that it has had for our systems, our taxpayers, who are now bearing the weight of the burden of these really oversaturated systems, and also our communities and our families that are broken, and especially communities of color. And so there's people all over the place looking at very creatively at criminal justice reform, prison reform specifically, but also bail reform, which is a big issue that's also concurrently happening at this time at the legislature.
Here on bail reform,
and then just thinking a lot more creatively about diversions, alternatives, trying to keep people in the community who can be kept in the community, investing more in community-based programming, health-oriented programming, and supportive programming, and re-entry, and then especially, like Justin just said, rehabilitation. It's all about making sure that, a friend of mine always says, today's inmate is tomorrow's neighbor. So we have to make sure that if we can reduce the population, looking at sentencing reform is a huge movement right now across the nation. Everybody trying to reconsider who needs to be in prison and how long do they need to be there really. And while they're there, if we can reduce the number of those people, how much money can we have left for the people to make sure that those people are well rehabilitated and well supported when they return to the communities, so that they can have that three-legged stool, hopefully even more support from their community, family, and economic support as well.
So knowing this, seeing greater support throughout the community, and a better understanding of why this is effective and works, what's the bottleneck here today that we need to get past for this to get over that hump to where we're going to have those layers to be able to make this type of change effective?
Well, one way to think about the bottleneck is to consider what is the driving factor in terms of implementation, and that is money. This is a very important issue, and as Director Spinner was talking about, there have been points in time where there has been some allocation of funds to be able to change the system, but not necessarily to the extent where there could be fundamental change. Now, I get back to this point that the expenditure that's anticipated will be over $500 million if we recreate what's already there, which would be a mistake. So the bottleneck in some ways has been the need for funding. Now funding is required because the money has got to be spent to build a new jail. And therefore, given the fact we do have a legislature that's really focused on this and is becoming, I think, very open to On the new jail, very focused on the new jail, and also focused on new rehabilitative approaches and expanded rehabilitative approaches, like, for example, the treatment courts that have proven to be very effective and brought down recidivism. There potentially could be a doubling of treatment courts, like, for example, the Fernhurst program, which is an example of a program for reentry for women that's been extraordinarily successful. And the Office of Hawaiian Affairs has some very powerful community members who are prepared for and have been experienced in the idea of reentry that's culturally based. So now we could have money to be able to implement what the legislature recognizes as change in terms of taking especially people that are incarcerated that are clearly mentally ill, clearly drug addicted. And I get back to the fact that in the jail there's almost half of the people that haven't been convicted yet. This is a group that has not committed a violent offense. Over 70% of them are there for non-violent offenses. So you can see it's a group that's pregnant for treatment. And I think the task force as well as the legislature recognizes that. So I think the bottleneck is going to be broken relatively quickly because the money has to be spent here within the next 2 or 3 funding cycles.
Director Espinosa, let me ask you this. What are your thoughts on this? The discussion over the need for a new facility, whatever size it may be, big or small, and how money might be allocated elsewhere for other types of programs. What is your reality?
Well, the governor's made it very clear in 2 state of the state speeches already, and his high priority in the Department of Public Safety is to relocate the Oahu Community Correctional Center from its current site to what has now been identified as the Animal Quarantine Station in Hālawa. Make no mistake about it, because of the value of the land dictated by the rail passing in direct proximity, there is a much better public use for the property, be it affordable housing or different redevelopment for the long-suffering Kalihi community. That is the genesis behind this. The state of Hawaii can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We really need to get rid of and exchange our old, outdated, and potentially, litigious Oahu Community Correctional Center. And with that opportunity, we can also free up, as the governor wants, a valuable piece of property in Kalihi for that community.
Some questions from some folks. Let me get to some of this, and some are a little bit in different areas, so bear with me on this one. Contraband in the prison system. Cannabis, crack, ice, tobacco, others saying it's rampant in Hālawa. I think this all kind of goes to some of the programs that are already in place and sort of what you've been involved in as far as what needs to change and what is going to be included in the redevelopment of a new prison. Somebody else asking about you mentioned the number of staffers to address certain aspects of reentry, if it's enough. And if enough is being done to sort of not only build a new facility, but to address some of the issues of either recidivism, reentry, drug addiction, mental issues within the prison system and then exiting the prison system. What's the balance there? What's being included as we move forward in this particular plan?
Well, the new jail would be built with, the best technologies and primarily a treatment facility. The problem of prison contraband is something that's universal. It's often said that the problems of society are reflective exactly in the prison. Just like there are contraband or illegal drugs in society, there's going to be that in the prison, and we battle every single day. The thought that our prisons and jail are rampant with these things is just not proven by fact. It's anecdotal at best, and in fact, our random urinalysis program of both the inmates and the staff do not reflect.
So do you think that the new jail, I was saying prison, that's being developed, what's included in there are the types of technologies or other types of structure that would address some of the issues in a very, very old facility, or
Certainly there will be improvements that will allow for better detection of contraband issues, but I got to go back to the fact that, anecdotally, if people are going to say that our prisons and jails are rife with, introduced contraband, again, the statistics, our research, our data on all of our shakedowns that we conduct regularly just does not bear that out.
A lot of people asking about what's at the heart of what you do, Native Hawaiians, and the treatment, disparate treatment. According to this viewer, supporters of the Hawaiian receive disparate treatment charge to demonstrate that Hawaii's courts are treating Hawaiians differently than offenders of other nationalities, white, Japanese, Filipino. So there are concerns, whether it be within the prison system or within the pipeline, that there are issues with how this particular population is moving through the justice system. How much is this being addressed in the new task force recommendations? Do you feel that it's enough? Do you feel that there are other issues that need to be addressed?
Just before you start, I want to let you know the January count of inmates and detainees who self-identify as Hawaiian or part Hawaiian throughout our system is 37.4%. So from there, Kamaile can go on.
Yes, so actually in the statewide adult population, we represent roughly 18%, whereas in the prison system, about 37. So it's come down a bit in recent years, but not enough, as I would say. It's kind of like, first of all, one of the recommendations that was made in the Native Hawaiian Justice Task Force report, one of the only recommendations that was actually acted upon was that the judiciary actually implemented implicit bias training for all of its judges and staff to try to combat these issues of implicit bias in treatment of Native Hawaiians, and as well, everybody, all minorities or people who are disadvantaged communities. And so that was one effort that was taken. But I think in general, Native Hawaiians are disproportionately represented among impoverished communities, among low educational attaining youth. And so there's actually a lot of different places, mental health issues as well. And so there's just so many places where Native Hawaiians are overrepresented, that kind of incubates the likelihood that they would be over-policed and then overrepresented as they move through the system. So it's impossible to look at it in the context of the prison alone or in the courtroom alone. It is actually, it's systemic. It's statewide, and it really has to be treated that way. And then the same thing goes with all of the treatment. As Director was talking about, we're talking a lot about a new jail being built, and that's kind of the big focus. That's what kind of pushed this whole movement forward with regard to the task forces. But I want to be clear that when we're talking about a jail versus a prison, a jail is generally mostly pre-trial, people who are awaiting their trial, as well as sentenced individuals who have very low sentences, and then as well, so short stays.
Year or less.
I'm sorry?
Year or less.
Yeah, a year or less, correct. Yeah. And then people who are re-entering, transitioning from the prison back into the community will stay in the jail and then re-enter into the community. So it's actually a lot of people and it's a lot of movement, whereas a prison is the people who are serving their sentences long-term. So when we're talking about building a jail and we're talking about kind of alleviating the overcrowding of specifically OCCC, we're not talking about every other facility, and we're not talking about bringing people home from saguaro. So, it might be a great facility, it might be technologically advanced and have all of, serve all of the needs that we now know from research would be needed in order to create a rehabilitative and therapeutic approach for those specific people who are going to be able to access, that specific facility. But it needs to be, again, same with everything, it needs to be a systemic approach, a systemic view. And so we could talk about $500 million for this specific facility, but I would say that's still not enough, because that's not enough to put more mental health practitioners in the community to treat people in the community before they become criminal. It's not enough to not fix the housing crisis and still have homeless people and then expand criminalization of homelessness and then keep raking up homeless people and sending them to the jails. It's not enough, if we're not dealing with an overarching view, and especially like on the neighbor islands and in the prison system, sentencing reform, trying to reduce the population through sentencing reform and diversion and alternatives, then we're still going to have issues in every other facility. 7 out of 9 of our facilities are overcrowded or getting there, and we're still going to be dealing with the severe costs and consequences for our communities. So it has to be dealt with from a bird's eye view. Like, there needs to be just more investment in all of these places. It can't be fixed with a single facility or with a single viewpoint, like looking only at one specific group.
Yeah, Kamaili is exactly right there. I mean, there's, building the new facility to replace OCCC is putting out a fire, but it's not addressing the entire problem, which is really systemic and societal. I mean, when you look at the history of Hawaii, people coming here from outside Hawaii and basically reducing the Hawaiian people to a marginalized population and an underserved population, a population was almost exterminated. And as a result of that history, now we have a criminal justice system where Native Hawaiians come into contact with the criminal justice system at a rate that far exceeds other groups. And so building a new facility in Hālawa Valley, that's not going to fix that problem. Bringing in additional treatment options, bringing in the societal system reinforcements that will allow that community to rebuild itself from the various traumas it's been through over the past 50, 60, 100, 200 years.
And I think this question, to interrupt you just a little bit, I think a couple of these questions relate to what you're talking about here, asking, is it possible that some homeless commit crimes as a way to get into prison and off the streets? And do we really need another prison to house drug users? Couldn't that be money spent on other things? And I think that goes back to sort of what's populating this jail and how we need to stop that population from growing. Yeah,
well, I mean, and Justice Wilson is right. We have people sitting in the facilities that haven't been convicted of crimes, but if they're drug users that are sitting there and they're drug users that want to get clean, chances are they're sitting there because we can't find a bed space for them. The treatment options are so limited here in Hawaii. You've got 1 or 2 real robust programs here on Oahu that are residential and long-term and low population. And, for a bed space to come up, we've got somebody sitting for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and they know that if they get out, they're just going to start using again. And they are saying, just please find me a bed, get me there as soon as you can, and we still are unable to fill that need. So it goes so far beyond one switch that we can flick or one lever that we can pull. It's got to be the whole machine needs to be taken apart and cleaned.
Yeah, another one brought up by Keone here, big factor pertaining to our juvenile justice system, lack of treatment and services within the area for juveniles, which then creates that cycle.
Well, juvenile justice, that's one area where I think everyone can agree that Hawaii has actually been way out ahead of the curve.
Great, yeah.
We have reduced the number of children sent to the youth correctional facility by 90%.
Yes.
Why is that?
Over the past decade. Because the judiciary, the state, all the service providers, all the stakeholders looked at what we were doing with juvenile justice and said, this isn't working. The state also got some great grant monies from the Annie E. Casey Foundation to do juvenile detention alternatives to incarceration program that we've been doing for basically the past decade. And we've reduced the number of petitions speaking in our circuit, we've reduced the number of petitions we file in juvenile court by 80% over the past 10 years with no negative impact at all on the public safety. And in fact, we're doing a better job at addressing and intervening with these kids at a younger age. So it's a little bit of a digression, but hopefully that's the kind of thing that will start paying dividends down the road as these kids age out into adulthood and they're not going straight from juvie court at age 17 and 11/12. All of a sudden they commit another crime once they're 18 and all of a sudden they're in circuit court or district court and sitting in big kid jail. Yeah.
I started my corrections career at the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility where the count was about 165 to 170. This was back in the early 80s. The count there now varies between 20 and 25.
Really?
All of those changes are not made by the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility. It was the upstream changes made by the courts, program and service providers, and just a complete change in the mentality of how we were going to treat that population. So, with that being a model, there is a potential for rethinking the way we do business, changing paradigms that we've been stuck with for so many years. And like I said, I got to take who I'm given, and I can't release anyone that the board says I can't release. But if changes are made in those processes, the opportunity to reduce our population through upstream systemic changes is modeled by the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility.
So let me ask you a little bit of a direct question. So when, just Wilson talking about the cost to build this new jail, and whether or not that's justified to spend that amount of money for this type of facility when, correct me if I'm wrong, some of that money could be used for other things that might have more of an effect on the population, keeping them out of prison. What are your thoughts on that when you think about the bodies and the people that you're having to deal with right now, the size of that population, the overcrowding that's happening, the facility that you're dealing with right now? Can we afford to have a smaller facility at this point in time?
Unless there are systemic changes, paradigm changes in how, who is going to get incarcerated. I'm stuck with dealing with the world the way it is today. I believe systemic changes can occur. No one would be happier if I had 500 inmates at OCCC instead of 1,200 inmates at OCCC, but I do not make that determination. Until that becomes a reality, my situation is such that I need to plan for facts as they exist on the ground right now.
Here's a question. Was this ever considered, since cost and resources is an issue, would Hawaii consider relocating the main prison to the Big Island, where the land is abundant? Was that, I'm guessing that's not that simple of a question. There's a bunch of land over there, we're fine.
There were plans back during the Kagetano administration that got shelved because of major community protests over there. And we knew that we were going to face difficulties in manning an institution that size, between 2,000 and 3,000 beds. But I must say, having lived through that, had we done that, we would not have the 1,457 inmates we have on the mainland right now.
Insight. All right. As far as the rehabilitation models that are being considered at this point, Elsie and Cheryl bringing up some of the models in other countries, if that had been looked at. The recommendations that you're putting forth now, where did you get a lot of your research, your input from?
Well, I would
other successful systems elsewhere.
Respond to that in two categories. One is domestic, locally based, and the other has to do with jurisdictions outside of Hawaii. There is a group that's part of the task force that went to Norway.
And we're talking about Scandinavia and Germany.
Yes, and so that is a proven system where the recidivism rate is the lowest in the Western world, in Norway and in Sweden.
So what's happening
now,
there?
Keep in mind, for example, Sweden is 7 times our population, and it has an incarcerated population that's approximately the same as ours. So they've been very successful in keeping down not only the recidivism rate or the crime rate, but also the cost of incarcerating people. Why? The rehabilitative system that they use involves correctional officers being in a treatment mode. That has a lot to do with it. One of the difficulties in the system.
What do you mean by a treatment mode?
Well, for example, they have a dynamic security system where when an inmate comes into the institution, there is a correctional officer that in essence is assigned to them. And then they work together long term. And the dynamic security means security that is a moving dynamic process between the inmate and the correctional officer. And in that way, the correctional officer's work environment improves dramatically because they are able to work in a constructive way. That makes a huge difference. The other thing is that, as Director Espinda says, straightforward rehabilitative practices are employed that are modeled, and I get to the domestic side, that is represented by the treatment courts and represented by what happened with the juvenile justice system that has taken place on all the islands, but particularly on Oahu. What is it that we succeeded in doing domestically? It was just a matter of bringing in counselors, hiring counselors that were focused and could give services on a regular basis to juveniles. Also providing for a place for them to live. sort of a re-entry process for young people. So it became apparent that it wasn't necessary to have an incarcerated environment where you had 100 children. This is a model that has already been employed here in Hawaii, and we can apply it. But it does require also improving the conditions for the correctional officers. It's a miserable place to have to work. You know, this prison not only is very old, but it was originally designed for, the design was for approximately 650 people. There are twice as many people. The cells often have 3 people in the cell. The suicide watch cell often has 3 people that are on suicide watch at the same time. What's my point? The point is, by just giving the correctional officers a chance to get the training and a chance to be in a therapeutic environment, it will change things dramatically, along with the treatment opportunities outside of a purely incarcerated setting, where you've got a facility, for example, that will provide for treatment at a very, very low security level. So you don't have a focus so much on punitive atmosphere as much as it's rehabilitative.
We've only got about 5 minutes left, believe it or not, but I wanted to quickly ask about the drug courts, because there's a couple of questions about that, and both of you being very involved in that happening. What role do our drug laws play in overcrowding? What states have reduced drug possession sentences from felonies to misdemeanors? Something for Hawaii, question mark, from Carl. And is anyone on the panel familiar with the Veterans Court headed by Judge Kubo? Of course you are. Is this a good model for other parts of the system? That's from Frank. So I think just sort of wondering sort of what's been happening with that. Give us a little update, because there's some
Part
big
of the
success.
proposal of this task force is to double the treatment courts, because again, this model that is local, that was applied to the juvenile justice system that works so well, is also a model that's working very well for adults when it comes to treatment courts, where there are services available for those that are committed to change, but in a conjunction with being treated, they come before the court, and if they don't comply, these individuals who have been convicted of crimes that are in the treatment courts, if they don't comply, they're incarcerated. And so that provides an added incentive to comply with the treatment.
Seen some big success on the neighbor islands.
Yeah, drug court and veterans court are, we just started our veterans court on Kauai as well. And, but, drug court is an amazing program. My favorite days as prosecutors are when I get to go to the drug court graduations and see these people who came into the system at the lowest point in their lives, and they're leaving, back with their families again, with jobs, with coping skills, with support systems. Seeing that makes it all worthwhile, and it makes me happy, as an administrator, because, hey, I'm probably not going to see these people back in my courtroom again. That's great. If you get arrested in the Fifth Circuit and you're facing a felony drug charge, and you want to turn your life around and you want to get better, we're going to give you that opportunity. You're going to have the opportunity to go to drug court. Now, there's unfortunately a certain sector of that population that would rather take their chances on probation and hope they can get by, and they're not at that point where they want to change their lives yet. But I want to put as many people through the drug court program as I can, because that is one less person that I'm going to have to deal with in the future. And that, to me, when I run into them at the supermarket, at the food land in Kapaa, in 6 months, I want to see them happy and smiling and have them.
A good chance you will.
Right.
Small.
Have them say hi and, hey, we had a great experience.
Unfortunately, we only got a couple minutes left, but I want to squeak this question, and I think it kind of lends to the population that you're dealing with. This is from Cheryl. Promising innovative model proposed on Molokai through the creation of agricultural farms, where incarcerated people could receive rehab services, benefiting exercise, sun, see the fruits of their labor. So I think the thrust being looking at sort of what touches people within their lives, within their cultures or societies, and how important that is, and some of the work that all of you, maybe you in particular, have done.
Definitely. What Justice Wilson was talking about earlier, the Norwegian model really employs a lot of those ideas. A lot of those ideas are proliferating all over the country with all these other jurisdictions we're talking about, looking at different ways to design and facilities as well as programs to allow light, access to the outdoors. It rings so true here, and especially for Native Hawaiians who resonate so much with the need for access to the land and just the space in general, that spiritual need to connect. And so all of that is such a huge part of rehabilitation here, and so we really hope to see that in future facilities and as a main facet of our rehabilitative programs in the future.
And we've got about a minute left, so I want to give the two of you a little bit of a shot as far as what we're moving forward, what's happening right now and what's moving forward. Give about 30 seconds to what's sort of the next step where we're at as far as the bringing in this new jail.
Well, we have completed the environmental impact statement. It is gone completely through without contest. That's been accepted. And the identified place is, of course, the animal quarantine station. We are now working with the city on the permitting process. The next step is the largest step, which is finding a methodology for funding this project. Clearly, the traditional route of funding it through the legislature with a geo bond process is not doable. It would take the whole state's 1 year CIP budget to
and
fund
no doubt
this.
that's going to be a long discussion and a lot of details. I'm going to have to leave it there. I know we talked about some of the recommendations, things, a lot of moving parts here. So thank you so much for all of you for joining us. Mahalo to you for joining us. Thank our guests, Michael Wilson, State Supreme Court Associate Justice, Justin Kohler, Prosecuting Attorney for the County of Kauai, Kamaile Maldonado, Public Policy Advocate for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and Nolan Espinda, Director of the Hawaii Department of Public Safety. All right, next week on Insights, ask yourself and then answer this question: are you ready to retire? Join us for that, what promises to be a lively discussion. I'm Laura Yamada for Insights on PBS Hawaii. Ahui ho. It's a hang.